Hi, kids. Here we are again. That was fun having that meeting today, even though it was kind of awkward. It's kind of difficult. And like Mauricio said, a lot of people have the internet connections, including mine, go out and in and stuff. But anyway, um, here we are again with reading Edward Tulane. And here's the stuff I asked you last time was there was this line that said about the grandmother. She was looking at Edward the way something something looked at something. I can't remember what the line is, and I'm holding this so I can't get the book. But what I was asking you guys was, so he's a rabbit, and she was looking at him like she was a predator and he was the prey. So it didn't seem, so it kind of tells you that there's something about her that's kind of dangerous. That's what I thought. And then in the next chapter, it talked about after in the story about the princess who got turned into a warthog. It said that the cook, after butchering the warthog, so warthog is kind of like a wild pig that lives in the forest, and then butchering, it's like when you go to the butcher, like on 24th Street. If you go to the carniceria, that's a butcher. So they get a big cow in there, like a half a cow, and then they cut it up into all the different kinds of meats like carne asada and whatever, all the kinds of meats, and carne molida. They take it, they grind it up and stuff. And then the last thing was in that chapter, the theme that I was asking you about, which I think is, I feel like this is one of the favorite themes of Kate DiCamillo, is love. Like, are you a person who can feel love? And the princess, it said, remember, she didn't want to get married, which is reasonable, but it says she couldn't feel love, and that was the reason why there were consequences, I guess. Um oh yeah, the witch says, consequences. You dare talk to me about consequences? Tell me the name of the one you love. Love. Why must everyone speak of love? Whom do you love? I love no one, said the princess proudly. You disappoint me. And that's when she turned her into the warthog. And then remember, Abilene really loves Edward. And at the end, she says, Edward, I love you. I don't care how old I get. I will always love you. Yes, yes, thought Edward. And then he was looking at the stars. So now we're on chapter 5, which shows, I was telling you guys, shows a chest. What's it called? A trunk that they're filling up with stuff to go on their sea voyage on ship. The house on Egypt Street became frantic with activity as the Tulane family prepared for their voyage to England. Edward possessed a small trunk, and Abilene packed it for him, filling it with his finest suits and several of his best hats and 3 pairs of shoes, all so that he might cut a fine figure in London. Before she placed each outfit in the trunk, she displayed it to him. She would hold it up. Do you like this shirt with this suit? She asked him. Or, would you like to wear your black derby? You look very handsome in it. Shall we pack it? The black derby is a kind of a hat. And then finally, on a bright Saturday morning in May, Edward and Abilene and Mr. and Mrs. Tulane were all on board the ship, standing at the railing. Pellegrina was at the dock. On her head she wore a floppy hat, strung around with flowers. She stared straight at Edward. Her dark eyes glowed. Goodbye, Abilene shouted to her grandmother. I love you. The ship pulled away from the dock. Pellegrina waved to Abilene. Goodbye, lady, she called. Goodbye. Edward felt something damp in his ears. Oh, Abilene's tears, he supposed. He wished that she would not hold him so tight. To be clutched so fiercely often resulted in wrinkled clothing. Finally, all the people on land, including Pellegrina, disappeared. Edward, for one, was relieved to see the last of her. As was to be expected, Edward Tulane exacted much attention on board the ship. That means everyone paid attention to him. What a singular rabbit, said an elderly lady with 3 strings of pearls wrapped around her neck. She bent down to look more closely at Edward. Thank you, said Abilene. Several little girls on board gave Edward deep glances full of longing. They asked Abilene if they might hold him. No, said Abilene. I'm afraid that he's not that kind of rabbit who likes to be held by strangers. 2 young boys brothers named Martin and Amos took a particular interest in Edward. "What does he do?" Martin asked Abilene on their second day at sea. He pointed at Edward, who was sitting on a deck chair with his long legs stretched in front of him. "He doesn't do anything," said Abilene. "Does he wind up somewhere?" asked Amos. "No," said Abilene, "he does not wind up." "What's the point of him, then?" said Martin. "The point is that he is Edward," said Abilene. That's not much of a point," said Amos. "Yeah, it's not," agreed Martin. And then after a long thoughtful pause, he said, "I wouldn't let anyone dress me like that." "Me neither," said Amos. "Do his clothes come off?" asked Martin. "Of course they do," said Abilene. "He has many different outfits. And he has his own pajamas, too, and they're made of silk." Edward, as usual, was disregarding the conversation. A breeze was blowing in off the sea, and the silk scarf wrapped around his neck billowed out behind him. On his head he wore a straw boater. That's another kind of hat. The rabbit was thinking that he must look quite dashing. It came as a total surprise to him when he was grabbed off the deck chair, and first his scarf and then his jacket and pants were ripped from his body. He heard his pocket watch hit the deck of the ship, and then, held upside down, he watched the watch roll merrily towards Abilene's feet. "Look at him," said Martin. "He's even got underwear." He held Edward aloft so that Amos could see. "Take it off," shouted Amos. "No!" screamed Abilene. Martin removed Edward's underwear. Edward was paying attention now. He was mortified. He was completely naked, except for the hat on his head, and the other passengers on board the ship were looking at him, directing curious and embarrassed glances his way. "Give him to me!" screamed Abilene. "He's mine!" "No," said Amos to Martin. "Give him to me." He clapped his hands together and then held them open. "Toss him," he said. "Please," cried Abilene. "Don't throw him. He's made of china. He'll break." Martin threw Edward, and Edward sailed naked through the air. Only a moment ago the rabbit had thought that being naked in front of a shipload of strangers was the worst thing that could happen to him. But he was wrong. It was much worse being tossed, in the same naked state, from the hands of one grubby, laughing boy to another. Amos caught Edward and held him up, displaying him triumphantly. "Throw him back," called Martin. Amos raised his arm, but just as he was getting ready to throw Edward, Abilene tackled him, shoving her head into his stomach and upsetting the boy's aim. And so it was that Edward did not go flying back into the dirty hands of Martin. Instead, Edward Tulane went overboard. That's the end of chapter 5. And chapter 6 just shows his hat, the straw boater, flying through the air. So let's see what's going to happen. How does a china rabbit die? Can a china rabbit drown? Is my hat still on my head? These were the questions that Edward asked himself as he went sailing out over the blue sea. The sun was high in the sky, and from what seemed to be a very long way away, Edward heard Abilene call his name. "Edward!" she shouted. "Come back!" Come back? Of all the ridiculous things to shout, thought Edward. As he tumbled ears over tail through the air, he managed to catch one last glimpse of Abilene. She was standing on the deck of the ship, holding onto the railing with one hand. In her other hand was a lamp? No. It was a ball of fire? No, Edward realized. It was his gold pocket watch that Abilene held in her hand. She was holding it up high, and it was reflecting the light of the sun. My pocket watch, he thought. I need that. But then Abilene disappeared from view, and the rabbit hit the water with such tremendous force that his hat blew off his head. That answers that question, thought Edward, as he watched the hat dance away on the wind. And then he began to sink. He sank and sank and sank. He kept his eyes open the whole time, not because he was brave, but because he had no choice. His painted on eyes witnessed the blue water turning to green and then to blue again. They watched as it finally became as black as night. Edward went down and down. He said to himself, "If I'm going to drown, certainly I would have done so by now." Far above him, the ocean liner, with Abilene aboard it, sailed blithely on, and the China Rabbit landed finally on the ocean floor, face down, and there, with his head in the muck, he experienced his first genuine and true emotion. Edward Tulane was afraid. The next chapter, chapter 7, shows a gigantic wave. So we will see. I've seen how long it is. It's a little bit longish, so I'm not going to read it today. And I think I made a comment. I think I was wrong when I made a comment that Edward had emotions, because this says he experienced his first genuine and true emotion. He was afraid. He had thoughts before, but apparently not true emotions. And fear is something that we all feel at certain times, many times, especially when we don't know what's going to happen. And so why don't you think about, if you haven't read the book already or heard it, think about, what do you think is going to happen to Edward? He's at the bottom of the ocean with his head in the muck, which means like the sand and the dirt and whatever's at the bottom of the ocean, plants that are decomposing, kelp, fish bones, I don't know. Think about what is going to be the next chapter of his journey. Because remember, the book is called The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. So thanks for listening. Put comments on, I'm going to post this as Edward Tulane chapter 5 and 6. Remember, please don't put comments like chatting comments. Just put comments about the story. And I will read 7 and 8 tomorrow. And like we said in the meeting, we'll take off Saturday and Sunday, and then I'll be back on Monday. So see you tomorrow.